a WPC 89 driver board that blew the 5-volt fuse as soon as I powered it on. So let's figure out why. This is BR2, it's Bridge Rectifier 2, and it rectifies the AC coming in on this connector. You can even see the trace. And this is the source of the 5-volt power, which gets filtered by C5 at this location. So I've got my meter set to diode check, black on the oddball leg, I call it. And let's see, this is charging a cap. Let's let it go and see what happens. So that is fully charged up, and that leg is okay. Move over here, and we have a good reading. Here we have a good reading, but here we have a short, so this cap is going to need to come out. So let's do that. Step one is to remove this number 10 screw from both the cap you're taking out and BR1. And you could hear the heatsink drop out. Let me get those screws out of there. Nice. Here's our screws, here's our heatsink. We'll set that aside. Sorry for all this flipping around. This is the shorted bridge rectifier, so we're just going to creep underneath here and cut the legs right off of that devil. Excellent. And this is no good. It's going in the trash can. Got my iron heated up. Fortunately, nobody's molested this bridge rectifier in the past. And I'm going to heat up each of these legs individually and just pull the leg out. This procedure, or this method of this procedure, guarantees that you're not going to tear any through holes. I see a lot of guys with their Haco 808 or whatever's the current one, and they'll try to pull the solder out of there before you remove the bridge rectifier, and it's just not a good way to go. Now I do have my Haco 808, and I'm going to use it to clean up these holes. That one didn't clean up very well because there's a lot of solder heat sink on the back of that, but we did get 2 of them. Let's flip it over and get the other 2. You can see how much thermal mass there was there. And clean up this one too. So you can see that we've gotten those holes nice and clean. We haven't molested this fine trace that eventually goes to the general illumination circuit here and here. This leg and this leg feed the GI circuit. So let me get another bridge rectifier. I'll be back. New bridge for my parts supply and some super lube. And I like to put a little bit on the top of the new bridge. And you don't need to go crazy with this stuff. A little dab will do you, as we used to say. Maybe got a little too much on there. And then I put it on top of the old bridge because the old heat transfer paste is worn out. And then we will screw the new bridge to the heat sink. See if I can get that aligned, the holes aligned. Whoops. There we go. The legs aligned with where they'll go through the holes. Then I'm gonna apply the assembly back to the board. I haven't done anything with BR1 yet. We don't want to do anything with BR1 yet. And we don't want to solder BR2 into place yet. So I have put the assembly back in the board. I'm going to flip it over so I can reinstall the screw onto BR1. And what this does, by doing it in this order of operations, is it guarantees that the top of BR1 and the top of BR2 are in the same plane. Because you don't want to fracture the solder joints by soldering them first and then screwing the new bridge down. So I've got both screws tightened up, and now we are going to just solder BR2 in place. So get yourself some solder, apply, and once the solder is fully molten into a nice solder meniscus, you just drag the iron up the leg and you've got a nice solder joint. Last thing to do is to let the solder cool, and some people will clip the legs before they apply the solder. I don't know if it makes much difference, but what you want to make sure you do is you don't trim down into the solder meniscus. So I just raised my side cutters up just a little bit, and you've got a little bit of leg still sticking out way above the solder meniscus, or the solder volcano. Check out the other side. Looks good. Let's go to the test rig now and see if it works. You gotta remember to change the blown fuse. This goes 5 amp, 7 amp, 5 amp, 8 amp normal blow. Now somebody else has been in here and replaced all these capacitors, these 15,000 microfarad caps, with these big ass ugly super tower caps. I hate these things, but if it works, I leave it. There's no sense in replacing good parts with new parts. Back on the bench now, let's power it up, and you guys can witness either great success or miserable failure with me. This is the fuse that fuses the 5 volts, so let's power on. And the fuse is holding. And we have an LED lit where the 5 volts is. Unfortunately, we do not have a LED lit where the 12 volts is. So this board is a bit problematic. And I've just connected my voltmeters. This is the unregulated 12 volts. The regulated 12 should be shown here, but we don't have any voltage, so we're going to have to figure out why that is. Now, my first suspicion is some of these caps. So let me wiggle a few of them and see what happens. Well, that one's pretty solid. These are all pretty solid. One moment. Well, I had said that I was going to leave these big ugly caps, but it turned out that almost every through hole was pulled. So I have been repairing those. This one has only a trace on the back side, so it doesn't need a repair rivet, but those 3 plus these 2 over here both needed a repair rivet. This is a new technique I've been deploying after talking with my friend Jerry Claus and John Wart Jr. And back on the bench one more time with this board, and you can see I do have regulated 12 volts now. The 5 volts is at 4.95, that's good enough, and the unreg is at 14.9. Coil and flasher power, perfect. And she's booted. Now what happened when I was researching this is I put my hands on the heatsink for this 7812 and almost got scorched fingers. This is what your fingers look like when you work on boards all day. And so I changed out the 7812 for good measure, but then I went back and looked at these capacitors that somebody had installed, and there was no ground connection for C6 and C7. C6 and C7 filter the 18 volts, which gets regulated down to 12 volts. So I suspect that 7812 12-volt regulator was seeing full unrectified power, and it didn't like all that AC ripple that was in there. So I investigated the rest of these through holes, and unfortunately they all needed to be changed out. So we have a brand new set of 4X 15,000 microfarad caps, and we are good to test now. Shaky, it's right before lunchtime and I didn't eat breakfast. So we have got to get some of that coffee a little bit diluted. So let's get the solenoid test in repeat mode. I have the WPC DMD test ROM installed. So those are the first 16 solenoids. Let's go to GI test and make sure none of those traces were damaged. And they look like they're all going to work. Super nice. And we'll do lamp and flashers both at the same time. So there's all the flasher circuits at high speed, and the lamp matrix is working perfectly. So it looks like this old board is finally good to go after several trips back to the bench. And I guess the lesson learned for me is get rid of those caps, even though it's going to cost the customer a little bit more, because these caps go for, they're not an insignificant price, I'll say. Thank you. I'm putting this one in the W column.